Snow stung her face like betrayal as they dragged her toward the ravine's edge. Clara Westwood, skirts flaring in the wind. Each breath she drew rattled with pain and indignation. Her refusal to wed Mayor Cornelius Blackwell, a spark they meant to snuff. Ice-crusted pines leaned over the abyss, their needles rattling like warning bones. Clara's hand sought purchase on frozen earth. Her mother's scarf slipped free and fluttered into the void. Then, with a shove born of greed and spite, she tumbled down the ravine's lip into cold darkness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've got something extra special saved just for you. Clara's world dissolved into bone-chilling tumble. Each stone she struck was a hammer blow to memory. Her father's lullaby on ranch porch, her sister's laughter echoing through summer fields. She landed on a ledge, ribs screaming protest, but found purchase in mud and driftwood. Snow dusted her lashes. Breath came raggedly, each gasp a stolen gift. Blood seeped from a scalp wound, red as rust on black ice. She closed her eyes, whispering her mother's name into the hollow canyon. Gideon Harrington rode Coldwater's main street before dawn, lantern swaying against his weathered rifle stock. He guided his bay mare to the livery, coat dusted in last night's storm. His ranch lay east on Bitter Creek, but something, maybe the wind's lament or his own restless grief, drew him back toward town. 2 years passed. Fever stole his wife and daughter, turning his heart into a hollow well. Now only work and distance kept him breathing. He paused at the ravine's rim, noticing disturbed snow and a lone woolen glove entangled in sagebrush. Impulse seized him. He tethered his mare and edged down the trail, hand resting on coat hilt. Pine slab walls of the canyon pressed close. His boots crunched the thawing ground. Then he heard her, soft coughing above a drift of rocks, and found Clara cradled against a ledge, pale as winter moon. Clara opened her eyes to Gideon's face, a stranger's pity and concern mirroring her own shock. He knelt beside her, touching her uninjured arm with gloved gentleness. "You're alive," he said. She tried to speak, but her voice was a thin whisper lost in the wind. He retrieved the scarf from the snowbank, tucking it around her shoulders. Its wool warmth seeped into her soaked skirts. Gideon lifted her to her feet. She swayed like a sapling in gale. He supported her beneath one arm and guided her upward, each step a silent mercy. Clara's mind swirled with questions she could not voice. Why had Blackwell's men tried to kill her? Her family's farm lay downriver, safe from town's prying eyes. She pressed her gloved hand to her battered side. Wetness seeped through cloth. Gideon hoisted her onto his mare's back, blanket folded beneath her skirts. He mounted behind her, pressing a steadying hand at her waist, each heartbeat a promise to keep her from falling again. They reached Gideon's cabin as dawn fractured the sky, a simple pine slab structure warmed by stacked wood and hearth's glow. Gideon guided his mare to the corral and scooped Clara inside. He knelt by a blanket-draped couch and eased her down. She closed her eyes as he stoked embers into flame, lantern light dancing on rough walls. He fetched a cloth and warmed water in a kettle, pemmican stew simmering in cast iron. Clara sipped the broth, warmth blossoming through her chest like fragile hope. Gideon set a bowl beside her and extracted a leather pouch from his coat. He offered a knife's whetstone, scoured smooth by his father's trade, and handed it to Clara. She grasped it with trembling fingers, tracing carved initials at its base. G.H. He watched her, grief and longing stitched in his gaze, then nodded once. She understood. Share this tool, share trust. Outside, wind scoured Bitter Creek's frozen flow. Gideon closed shutters against storm's return and placed extra blankets at Clara's feet. She caught sight of his spurs hanging by the door, silent testaments to loss and labor. He settled on a stump by the hearth, rifle across his knees. Clara reached into her pocket and withdrew her mother's scarf, threadbare but fragrant with lavender. She pressed it into his palm. He studied its frayed edge, then wrapped it around his wrist, nonverbal vow born in wordless gratitude. Morning light found Clara binding her side with coarse linen from a trunk. Each tuck and knot eased pain and fear alike. Gideon chopped wood outside. Each swing of the axe rang like confession. He paused at the door and offered her a leather-bound journal, its pages empty but for a single entry, June 1874, when fever took his heart. Clara ran a finger across the worn leather. He nodded, eyes moist beneath sun-creased brow. She opened the journal and wrote a single line, "I don't trust words." Beneath, she traced a looped flourish, a promise to fill pages with truth. That evening, the wind whistled across frost-caked ridges. Clara sat by the hearth, journal open on her lap, trowel from her rescue resting at her side, a tool her father had once used to repair fences. She traced its handle's worn grain and found etched initials, H.W., her mother's gift. Then she looked at Gideon polishing the whetstone, each stroke shaping blade and heart alike. They exchanged a glance, forged in stone, grief and hope shaping new lives in firelight's glow. Before sleep claimed them, a knock rattled the door. Clara's heart seized. Gideon rose, Colt in hand. He unlatched the door to reveal Isaac Pratt, the storekeeper, face drawn with rumor's weight. "Mayor Blackwell asks after you," Isaac said, voice low as drifts outside. He held out a folded paper stamped with Cornelius's seal. "He's sending riders at dawn." Isaac tucked his hat and melted back into night. Gideon closed the door and slammed the latch. Clara slid from the couch and pressed her back to his chest. She placed the trowel and journal on a trunk, symbols of past and future intertwined. Gideon tucked his Colt into its holster and placed the whetstone at the hearth's edge, tools of survival and mercy ready for tomorrow's dawn. In the hush before storm's return, Clara pressed her forehead to Gideon's chest and whispered her only vow, "I'm not alone." He gathered her into his arms, grief's echo quieted by shared ember of trust. Outside, wind scoured pine and plain as riders' hoofbeats thundered toward their door, a reckoning riding the frozen dawn. At first light, booted feet crunched on the porch, lantern glow bouncing across fractured glass. Clara's hand closed around the journal's cover. Gideon's finger hovered above the Colt's trigger. In the frozen stillness, the valley held its breath for the mayor's riders, and the price of a girl's freedom. Hoofbeats cracked the dawn's frost, Blackwell's riders circling Gideon's cabin like vultures over Clara's fragile refuge. Snow-dusted spurs glinted in the weak light as three men reined at the porch. Their leader, Deputy Ward, stepped forward, rifle slung low, breath misting in cold air. "Mayor Blackwell says you're to come back," he called, voice flat as ice. "Your family's land is his claim." Clara tightened the scarf around her throat, its wool edges mended by her mother's careful hand. Each stitch held comfort's echo and a whispered map sewn into the hem. She rose from the pine slab bench beside the hearth, eyes steady despite pain's dull ache in her ribs. Gideon stood behind her, Colt leveled at the riders' dusty faces. Ward spat snow. "He'll send for you by sundown." His gaze flicked to Gideon's rifle. "And he won't wait." Gideon's jaw clenched. He stepped onto the porch, Colt but resting against his hip. "She stays here," he said, voice low as canyon floor. "You won't take her." The deputy's eyes narrowed. He raised a weathered ledger, Blackwell's forged deeds bound in oiled hide. "Mayor paid for this. You're trespassing on his claim." Gideon leveled his Colt. "I'll shoot the ledger to ashes before she leaves." His tone carried the weight of two graves, wife and daughter taken by fever, leaving him nothing but regret and a stubborn need to protect what remained of family. Ward hesitated, rifle wavering. He spat into snow. "We'll be back." With that hollow threat, he and his men mounted and rode off, hoofs echoing across frozen pine. Clara exhaled, shoulders trembling against winter's chill. Gideon lowered his Colt and stepped inside. He secured the door's latch and slammed it against Gale's push. Clara sank by the hearth, scarf wrapped tight, trowel from her rescue resting on her lap. its carved handle etched with deed numbers cedar wrought in her father's hand. Gideon fetched steaming water in cast-iron kettle and poured it into wooden bowls. He offered Clara a canteen of strong chicory coffee. She accepted with a nod, lips close to the rim. The liquid's heat seeped into her chest. Each swallow a balm to trauma's raw wound. He set stew of pemmican and turnip before her. Simple fare that tasted of home and generosity. She closed her eyes between bites. Memories of her father's cook stove at dawn weaving hope into her nerves. After Dawn's meal, Clara retrieved her mother's scarf and laid it across her lap. She traced a hidden seam, tiny stitches in red thread forming letters and numbers like a cipher. She tugged the hem free and revealed a scrap of parchment folded beneath the wool, a surveyor's note marking mineral veins under her family's land. Blackwell's greed made sense now. The mayor sought more than her hand. He coveted the wealth beneath her fields. Gideon watched in silence, grief and resolve mirrored in his gaze. He set aside his rifle and knelt to examine the note. "Your refusal saved your life," he said softly. "But this is a claim worth dying for." He slid the parchment into his coat and pressed the scarf's hem to his palm. Promise bound in wool. Clara reached into her journal and wrote a single line. Her land is her own. She traced each letter with care, then tucked the journal into Gideon's coat pocket, a pledge that her story would be told. That afternoon, storm clouds gathered on wind-scorched ridges. Gideon chopped wood for rebuilding the barn. Clara sat on a stump, mending the scarf's torn edge with needle and thread. Each stitch was a prayer for safety and a defiance against husbands forced by power. She pressed the thread through like weaving her own fate, refusing to be bound by Blackwell's greed. Inside, Gideon paused at the door and watched her work. He brushed ash from his coat, fingers stained with charcoal. 2 years passed. He had watched the preacher mark his wife's fevered brow and his daughter's small hand slip from his grasp. Now he saw Clara's trembling fingers and felt kinship's pulsing grief's echo. He crossed and rested a gloved hand on her shoulder. Clara looked up, eyes brimming with both fear and trust. He nodded once, no words needed. As dusk fell, Isaac Pratt, the storekeeper, arrived with a lantern and solemn face. He stood in the threshold, boots dusted with town's gossip. Word spread, he said, voice low as gravity. Blackwell's hired counsel from Cheyenne. Legal writs sent to every rancher who might question his claim. He pressed a folded paper into Gideon's hand, noticed T.O. appear. Gideon's gaze darkened. He handed the notice to Clara. She unfolded it, eyes widening at the fine print. Attend Coldwater's court at first light or forfeit her land. She refolded the paper and tucked into the scarf's hem. Final proof of Blackwell's reach. Isaac tipped his hat. You're across the ravine, safe from prying eyes. But this writ will follow you. He turned and vanished into the night's hush. Clara rose and lit embers in the hearth. She slipped the scarf around Gideon's neck, like a noose turned into comfort. He knelt and placed a journal before her, spine warmed by her story's first words. She traced his name pen on the first page. Gideon Harrington, friend to the lost. She pressed her forehead to the journal's cover, grief and hope entwined. Gideon settled beside her on the hearth's edge. He removed his hat and traced the scarf's hidden seam. We'll face this together, he whispered. Clara nodded, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks. Outside, wind rattled pine boughs and pounded the cabin's logs as if summoning final reckoning. Clara and Gideon exchanged a steadying glance. He rested his hand on her knee. She gripped his in return. In that touch lay defiance and trust deeper than any vow. That night, Clara placed the trowel by the hearth, its carved handle catching lantern's glow. She draped the scarf over the tool's head, weaving thread, and went into a single promise. She closed her journal and set it on the windowsill. Then she returned to her cot, wrapping blankets tight around her shoulders. Gideon lit a single lantern on the table, and the cabin exhaled an ember's hush. Outside, hoofbeats thunder across frozen earth. Blackwell's riders returned for a final claim. Clara sat up, heart hammering like storm ragtail. Gideon rose, cold at his hip. She clutched the scarf and journal, a stitch-bound map and a story yet unwritten. Together, they faced the window's trembling light. Dawn's justice, or ruin, rode on spurs steel toward their fragile hearth. A knock split the dawn's hush, sharp as a rifle's crack. Clara's hand flew to her side. Gideon's finger hovered above the Colt's trigger. Outside, boots pressed the porch groaning under weight of law and greed. In the heart's dim glow, the cabin held its breath for the final act of Blackwell's claim. A knock shattered the cabin's hush, Coldwater's judgment pressing against Clara's fragile refuge. Lantern light quivered on pine walls as Gideon Harrington opened the door to Reverend Ezra Cole, cloak dusted in sermon's ash, eyes tempered by compassion. In his hand, a folded envelope stamped with Coldwater's seal. The court summons for Clara Westwood's claim. Clara watched the Reverend by the hearth, her scarf trailing from his hand like a banner of fragile hope. She rose, boots crunching on pine slab floor, and accepted the summons. Reverend Cole nodded toward Gideon. "We stand with her," he said softly. Mrs. Lydia Jenkins, the widow from town, appeared at his heels, her shawl gray as winter moss. She pressed a loaf of cornbread into Clara's palm, gift of solidarity baked in sorrow's furnace. Gideon closed the door against wind's plea. He stacked coals to rekindle embers as Clara tucked cornbread beneath her coat. The Reverend and widow exchanged a glance. Coldwater's undercurrent of fear and gossip was shifting. By dawn's first frost, Samuel's cabin lay empty a wagon. Clara mounted Gideon's mare, scarf wound tight, journal and trowel strapped at her side. Gideon rode his bay beside her, colt holstered but ready. Mrs. Jenkins followed in a buckboard, Reverend Cole guiding his horse through wind-scoured sagebrush. Hoofbeats pounded promise and fear on frozen earth. Snow-crusted ridges bowed beneath wind's weight. Cold light fractured through pines. Clara pressed her palm to the trowel's carved handle, its deed number cedar-wrought in hidden knot. Each number was a stone in her claim, each stroke of the chisel a vow to defy greed's claim. Coldwater's main street lay silent beneath lantern-lit eaves. The courthouse, a lantern frame of limestone and timber, loomed at its heart. Townsfolk gathered on porches, breaths misting into prayerful haze. Gideon tethered the mare. Clara dismounted and steadied herself with gloved hand on the trowel's hilt. She met Mrs. Jenkins' steady gaze, quiet courage firm beneath widow's knowing smile. Inside, oak benches lined plank floors. The gavel lay like a promise on the judge's desk. Reverend Cole and Mrs. Jenkins sat behind Clara. Gideon stood at her elbow, shoulders squared against memory's chill. Across the hall, Mayor Cornelius Blackwell sat flanked by his proxy, hired gun Brock Dunn, Spencer rifle slung and finger near trigger. Judge Whitman rapped his gavel. "We hear Mayor Blackwell's claim on the Westwood property," he intoned. He gestured to Blackwell's counsel, a ledger of forged deeds. Blackwell rose, voice slick as oil on frozen creek. "Miss Westwood's refusal to wed was dishonorable, but I offer clemency if she yields her claim. Otherwise, her land becomes mine by right of forfeiture." A murmur rippled through benches. Clara's heart thundered as she stepped forward, journal clasped to her chest. She opened to the first page. June 1870. Her father's map survey. Coordinates that matched the trowel's carved number. She extracted the surveyor's note from her scarf, the hidden parchment revealing mineral veins beneath her fields. "My father's land grant predates any contract," she said, voice steady as canyon walls. She laid the ledger's forged pages atop the judge's desk and pressed the trowel beside them. "This tool bears the deed's true number, registered in Washakie County. My claim stands." Blackwell's smile flickered like dying lantern. He pointed to Brock Dunn. "This man witnessed Miss Westwood's signature under duress. I submit his testimony." Dunn stepped forward, rifle balanced in leather strap. "Her father's map was altered to hide the veins," he said, voice as cold as winter birch. He glared at Clara. "You intend to steal what's rightly mine. Reverend Cole rose, voice rich as him. I witnessed the scarf stitching. Your men stole that note and planted forged deeds. He pressed his hand to his starched collar. My church stand for truth, not greed. Mrs. Jenkins nodded, voice trembling but strong. I baked that cornbread for her, not the mayor. The town knows her father's maps are true. A handful of merchants and ranchers stood, voices rising in murmur of support. Gideon rested a hand on Clara's shoulder. Silent anchor in storm swell. Each murmur shifted weight, from Blackwell's claim toward community's quiet defiance. Judge Whitman studied the trowel's carved number, then the surveyor's note in the scarf's fringe. He rapped the gavel. Mayor Blackwell's claim is dismissed. Miss Westwood's deed stands valid. He slid forged ledgers aside and sealed the ruling with his inked stamp. Let no man disturb her peace. Blackwell rose, spurs clicking like broken promises. He spat snow. This isn't over, he hissed. He swept from the bench room with Brock Dunn at his side, a shadow of menace riding their heels. Outside, snow fell like judgment upon Coldwater Square. Clara exhaled relief that tasted thawing ice. Mrs. Jenkins pressed Clara's hand. Reverend Cole offered prayer beneath wind-whipped steeple. Gideon guided Clara to buckboard, the trowel at her side a testament to victory born in labor's sweat. As they climbed the trail home, the wind whispered through pine boughs. Rumor of Blackwell's return with a final writ from Cheyenne's court. Each hoofbeat pounded their promise, to stand firm against greed's claim. That night, wind-swept snow blanketed the cabin's roof. Clara tended the hearth's embers, journal open on her lap, pages waiting for new entries of justice. She pressed her palm to the trowel's engraved handle and found a faint inscription she had not noticed. Coordinates pointing to a hidden deed chest-sealed in her family's trust. She traced the letters with trembling finger, proof that Blackwell's false deeds had no foundation. Gideon stacked firewood by the door, coat strapped to his saddle. He paused, catching Clara's gaze. She held up the trowel, no words needed. The map was sealed within wood and stone, her claim as enduring as the mountains. He nodded once, and she knew they would face whatever rode on tomorrow's wind. Just before dawn, a rider's whistle cut the pine-scented air, a note of summons and threat. Gideon stepped outside, rifle aside, as the wind-scoured silhouette approached on a black mare. The rider removed his hat. Brock Dunn, hired gun, eyes glinting with ice and intent. He dismounted and tossed a sealed parchment onto the porch. Mayor's final writ, appear in Silverton by sunset or forfeit all. He reined his mare, spurs ringing on wood. No mercy this time. He mounted and vanished into the storm's hush, leaving snow-dusted tracks and a promise of new trials. Gideon closed the door against winter's bite and pressed Clara close. She held the trowel to her heart, each carved line of stone in her promise. They would not yield. In the cabin's lantern glow, Clara opened the final writ and read its lines by firelight. Cheyenne's influence unleashed, Silverton's court calling her name. She traced a trembling circle in the paper and set it beside the journal. Gideon laid his hand over hers, their unspoken oath echoing across frost-lashed plains. They would stand together, come what may. Outside, the wind scoured the porch, dissolving Brock Dunn's tracks into snow. At the cabin door, hoofprint of another, unfamiliar and urgent, crossed the threshold. In the hush before dawn's reckoning, the valley exhaled. Silverton's trial loomed, and only courage bound by stone and steel could carry them through. Hoofprints scarred the dawn's frost, Blackwell's trap closing around Clara's fragile stand. Snow-dusted pines formed a gauntlet along the ravine's rim as Gideon Harrington guided Clara's mare into shadow. The wind scoured their faces, each breath stung with promise and peril. At a bend where rock overhung dark water, they found 3 riders blocking the pass, Blackwell's men in oilcloth and spurs, rifles leveled against winter's hush. Clara's heart pounded like avalanche thunder. She slid from the mare, scarf wrapped tight, trowel strapped to her belt, The surveyor's note hidden in its carved handle had revealed her father's deed chest buried in the ravine's lip, proof stronger than any forged ledger. Now the rider sought to crush her claim in blood and fear. Gideon nudged Clara behind a boulder. "Stay low," he whispered, Colt leveled against his ribs. He glanced at the ravine's edge. Stone slick with frost, water rushing far below. "We stand here," he murmured, voice a low gale, "or we fall." The lead rider dismounted and spat snow. "Blackwell says hand over Westwood's deed chest, or clear out." He tapped the Winchester's barrel. "Your father's map won't save you." Gideon eased his finger from trigger guard and stepped forward. "She stays." His stare cut through dawn's mist, grief and steel etched in every line. 2 years passed. Fever stole his wife and daughter. Each loss had carved a hollow he filled now with purpose. Protect this girl's life and land. The rider laughed, harsh as ice cracking on creek. "You die for a girl?" He raised his rifle. Clara sprang from behind the boulder, trowel in hand. Each carved notch tied to the deed's number, a key to her father's hidden chest. She sprinted toward the ravine's lip, wind-whipped pines brushing her skirts. "Look," she shouted, voice shuddering like storm-tossed branches. At her feet, a limestone slab marked with her father's initials heaved through soil. She pried at its edge with the trowel, steel biting stone. Gideon fired a warning shot over the riders' heads. "Go on," he called. "She's got the key." The rider hesitated, glancing between Gideon's Colt and Clara's urgent figure. Shots rang out, bullets chipping stone and wood. Clara dug the trowel into frozen earth and levered the slab free. Beneath lay an iron-bound chest, hinges ice and dew. She lifted it with trembling arms. Gideon covered her back, each shot echoing off the ravine's cliffs. He recalled his daughter's laughter, their small voices pleading for safety. Now he stood sentinel for Clara's life. He slipped behind another boulder and chambered around. A rider lunged. Gideon's Colt barked once into the snow, steel and echo weaving through pines. The rider fell, rifle clattering in drifts. Clara pried the chest open with a trowel, twisting out a sheaf of parchment. Original deed, county seal pressed into wax. Water ran in rivulets across inked signatures. She pressed the surveyor's note to the parchment, a pair of truths bound by blood and law. The riders faltered as Clara raised the parchment toward dawn's light. Reverend Ezra Cole and Mrs. Lydia Jenkins burst from timberline, each armed with rifle and prayer. Isaac Pratt followed with a line of townsfolk. Ranchers and merchants rallied by Coldwater's court. They formed a loose circle around Clara and Gideon, rifles leveled at Blackwell's men. Reverend Cole spoke into the winter hush. "You defile the law and God's land by force. These papers bear the county seal. Leave now." His voice was calm as chapel bell. The townsfolk murmured assent, true hearts rising against greed's cold gale. The riders spat snow and surveyed the growing circle. Without a word, they vaulted their mounts and vanished down the ravine trail. Hoofbeats swallowed by wind's roar. Clara closed the chest, pressing trowel's carved handle into her palm. Each notch of victory carved in oak and stone. She slid the original deed into her coat and wrapped the scarf's hem around its seal. Mrs. Jenkins placed a healing poultice on Clara's bruised wrist. Reverend Cole draped his coat over her shoulders. Gideon guided Clara to her mare, each step a benediction against terror's shadow. Clara mounted, chest still pounding with ice and relief. Her horse stamped on frost, breast steaming. Gideon climbed the saddle behind her, Colt at rest. They turned toward Coldwater. Community's rally of hope echoing in frozen pines. That night, in the cabin's warm glow, Clara laid the original deed beside the journal and trowel. She traced the parchment's ink, each signature a promise kept. Gideon stacked before the hearth. Flames crackled like grateful song. Clara held the scarf to her face, its scent of lavender and smoke binding past and present. She opened her journal to the final entry and wrote, "I stand free." Gideon crossed the room and placed his hand atop hers. No words needed. Their bond was forged in Stone's defiance and grief's quiet mercy. But dawn brought a new summons. A courier arrived, spurs ringing on pine slab floor. He handed Clara a folded parchment sealed in Cheyenne's governor's crest. Silverton Court calls your presence to hear Blackwell's final appeal. His nod was curt. Then he turned and strode into winter's hush. Gideon's jaw clenched. He lifted the parchment. Each word a herald of trials yet to come. Clara pressed the chest's lid closed, the trowel at her side. She met Gideon's gaze, resolute as mountain stone. Outside, wind scoured the ravine's rim, hollow echo of a final reckoning riding on Silverton's trails. In the cabin's lantern glow, Clara exhaled a breath of frost and hope, ready for the valley's last stand. On the porch, hoofprints of a lone rider paused beneath moonlight, hat low, cloak dusted with long roads. The court's final trial loomed across snow-dusted plains, and only courage bound by law could carry them through Silverton's gates. Hoofprints haunted the dawn's frost, Silverton's court looming over Clara's final stand. Snow-dusted pines bowed beneath lantern-lit eaves as Clara Westwood and Gideon Harrington entered the limestone hall. Reverend Ezra Cole and Mrs. Lydia Jenkins flanked them, each face etched with resolve. A lone rider. Turncoat Seth Calloway, Blackwell's former ranger, waited by the doorway, rifle in hand and conscience guiding him toward justice. Inside, oak benches grown under townsfolk's weight. Ranchers in duster, merchants in worn vests, miners with coal-blackened beards. Judge Samuel Whitman sat beneath fur-lined robes, gavel poised. Across the bench, Cornelius Blackwell's dark cloak swept the floor, his forged ledger stacked at his elbow. Brock Dunn, hired enforcer, stood silent at Blackwell's side, Winchester slung across broad shoulders. The hush fell like snow's first drift. Judge Whitman rapped his gavel. We hear Blackwell's final appeal on Westwood's claim. He nodded to Blackwell's counsel. Blackwell rose, voice smooth as icebreaker steam. Your Honor, Miss Westwood's inheritance is void by contract. I offer clemency if she yields her land. Otherwise, all mineral rights revert to my dominion. His tone dripped entitlement. Clara stood, scarf wound tight, trowel's carved handle at her hip. She opened her journal to the last entry, her father's letter folded within. She withdrew it and laid it beside the chest-deep parchment on the judge's bench. The letter's ink trembled in lantern light. Cornelius Blackwell swore to my face no gold lay here. He lied to seize what was not his. She pressed the trowel against the letter. My father's words and the deed seals stand unbroken. The courtroom held its breath. Seth Calloway stepped forward, removing his hat. I rode with Blackwell when he burned my cabin for questioning his greed. He swept his hand at the ledger. I saw him forge your father's signature. He told me to kill the mapmaker if I spoke. Calloway's voice shook but held truth steel. I cannot lie for him again. Blackwell's eyes flashed with rage. He bared his teeth. Traitor! He lunged toward Calloway, but Brock Dunn caught his arm. Calloway lowered his gaze. The judge pounded his gavel. Order! Mayor Blackwell, your claim is dismissed. These documents and testimony prove fraud and malice. He sealed the ruling with ink. You are exiled from Wyoming territory within 24 hours. A murmur of relief rolled through benches. Reverend Cole clasped his hands in silent thanks. Mrs. Jenkins pressed Clara's shoulder, a touch of kinship bright as dawn. Gideon's chest heaved with quiet triumph. Each breath echoed his vow kept. Outside, Silverton Square glowed with lamp and lantern. Clara stepped into falling snow, flakes drifting like absolution. Gideon offered his arm. She slipped into its brace. Lila and Rose, returned from Mrs. Paxson's care, greeted them with cheers muffled by woolen scarves. The townsfolk emerged, miners, ranchers, merchants, all nodding in respect. Even Sheriff Leary tipped his hat. Spurs clicking farewell to injustice. Clara lifted her scarf to her cheek, frayed edges now untouchable heirloom. She reached into her coat and drew the trowel's chisel, carving her father's initials into the courthouse door's wooden frame. A silent signature of truth. Laughter broke Winter's hush as Gideon wrapped the scarf around Clara's shoulders once more, each fold sealing their bond. That evening, they returned to Elk Ridge by lamplit wagon. Snow sparkled on sagebrush. Pine-scented air whispered hope. The barn lay mended by neighbors' hands. Timber squared and rafters secured with rawhide lash. Gideon guided the mare beside the newly built corral, where Clara dismounted and placed a journal on the porch railing. She pressed her palm to its leather spine. Stories written in grief and triumph. Inside, embers glowed on stone hearth. Pans of stew simmered in cast iron. Clara laid the original deed chest on the table, its iron bands gleaming in firelight. She opened it and traced the county seal's impression, her family's name restored. Gideon poured coffee from a pot stained by travel. She accepted with a nod, sipping warmth into her bones. After supper, Clara and Gideon stepped onto the porch beneath frost-crusted ridges. Lila and Rose skipped among lantern-lit lanterns strung between pine posts, each light a promise of many nights to come. Gideon lifted his daughters onto his shoulders. Clara tied her scarf's fringe to the corral post, a banner of survival and sovereignty. She pressed the journal's final letter to her heart and offered it to Gideon. He read the folded words. Her father's vow that truth would endure, and tucked it into his coat pocket beside his photograph of wife and child. Clara reached into Gideon's pocket and retrieved his marked journal. Empty pages now ready for new memories. She pressed it into his hand, trust bound in blank parchment. They stood together, dawn's glow tracing their silhouettes against the barn's shadow. Clara raised her hand to the ridge, each stone in her homestead a testament to steadfast hope. Gideon placed his hand over hers, the touch of vow beyond words. Home was not just land, but hearts held safe beneath Wyoming's wide sky. Days later, under sun-drenched plains and wind-scoured trails, the community gathered for a barn-raising feast. Gideon and Clara guided two teams, one to repair the cabin's porch, another to erect fence rails. Neighbors traded hammer blows and laughter. Lila and Rose passed biscuits from Mrs. Jenkins. Reverend Cole blessed each beam and board. Clara paused at the barn's threshold and looked to Gideon, heart full. He tipped his hat, wind lifting its brim, a silent salute. She tied her scarf's last knot into the barn's gable, mark of victory in warp and weft. Each knot bound her past a promise, freedom carved in timber and trust. As dusk fell over Elk Ridge, Clara and Gideon stood by the corral, rifles at rest. Rangers from Coldwater rode past, waves and nods trading across frozen air. The valley exhaled in embers glow, each lantern flicker a star community reborn. Clara pressed the trowel's handle to Gideon's palm, its carved number and chisel's edge now symbols of reclaimed identity. He wrapped the scarf around her shoulders once more, wool soft as dawn's first light. Clara looked at the ridge's silhouette, stone homestead standing firm against memory's tide. She placed her hand on Gideon's chest, hearing heartbeat steady as plow steel. He drew her close, neither spoke. Their bond needed no words, only the hush of wind, the warmth of hearth, and the promise that love born in trial would endure every dawn. Outside, snow fell like absolution, blanketing sagebrush and scars with silent white. In the hush of valley and pine, the homestead's lights glowed like hope captured in glass. Clara and Gideon remained on the porch steps, hearts aligned beneath Wyoming's endless sky. Home reclaimed, freedom sealed, and life's promise written one sunrise at a time.